Verity Callahan put her mother's locket in her coat pocket on a Tuesday morning in November of 1887, and did not take it out again until she was standing on a platform in a town she had never seen, in a state she had barely heard of, watching the train pull away behind her like a hand letting go. She had not planned to leave on a Tuesday. She had not planned to leave at all, not in any conscious, deliberate way. But some part of her had been packing for years, folding things small, setting things aside, the way a woman does when she understands, without anyone having to tell her, that the place she is living is not a place she is meant to stay. If you have ever smiled at a dinner table, while something inside you went perfectly quiet, this story is for you. Subscribe, follow Verity's journey all the way to the end, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I want to know how far this reaches. The autumn of 1887 had come early to Baltimore. Not the cold, though the cold was considerable, that particular Chesapeake cold that came in off the water, and found every gap in every wall. What had come early was the feeling of enclosure. The sense that the rooms of the Ashby house on Prospect Street had grown smaller without anyone having moved the walls. Verity had noticed it first in September, then again in October, and by November she had stopped pretending she hadn't noticed it at all. She had married Clement Ashby 3 years before, at 23, in the way that a certain kind of woman, in a certain kind of family married in 1884, with an understanding rather than a decision, with gratitude that someone had arranged it, rather than joy that she had chosen it. Her father's business had failed the winter before the wedding. Clement Ashby's family had interests in shipping and insurance, and several other things Verity had never been invited to understand. The arrangement had been clear to everyone involved, even if no one had used the word arrangement out loud. She had told herself she was practical. She had told herself that love was something that came later, after the adjustments, after the settling in. She had told herself a great many things in 3 years. She had become quite skilled at it. The night she stopped telling herself things began with a dinner party. Clement hosted dinner parties the way other men kept ledgers, methodically, with an eye toward what they would produce. He invited men who had things he wanted, and women who were attached to those men. And Verity moved through the evenings with the fluency of someone who had been trained for exactly this purpose. She knew which wines came when. She knew how to redirect a conversation that was going somewhere. Clement didn't want it to go. She knew how to laugh at the right moments and when to be quiet at all the others. That night there were 6 of them at the table. Clement and Verity, a business partner named Howard Pell and his wife, a pale, watchful woman named Dorcas who barely touched her food, a man called Sutton from the shipping office, unmarried, with the look of someone who found most things beneath his notice, and Clement's older brother, Garrett, who had come down from Philadelphia and who had always made Verity feel, in some way she could not fully articulate, like something that had been purchased at a reasonable price. The meal was good. The conversation was the kind of conversation that sounds like substance and contains almost none. Verity had excused herself between the fish course and the roast to speak to the cook about the timing of the dessert, and when she came back to the hallway she heard her name. Not called out. Mentioned. The way you mention furniture. She keeps the whole operation running, Clement was saying, and his voice had the particular warmth he used for audiences he respected. I don't have to think about any of it, not the house, not the social calendar, not the correspondence. She manages everything. Useful, Garrett said. More than useful, Clement. Easy, unbothered, the voice of a man describing a well-maintained piece of machinery. She was exactly what the situation required, and she's never once asked for anything beyond it. A pause. Verity stood in the hallway with her hand on the wall. Does she know what you think of her? That was Sutton, and his voice was not unkind exactly, just precise in the way that uncaring people sometimes are. Clement laughed. It was a short, pleasant sound. She thinks this is a marriage, he said. And then the table laughed too. All 4 of them. The way people laugh when someone has said a true thing and made it funny. Verity stood in the hallway for another moment. She counted the roses on the wallpaper, a habit she had developed in this house, the way you develop habits in places that don't quite fit. 7 roses between each doorframe. She counted to 14. Then she went back into the dining room and sat down and smiled, and remained perfectly composed through the apple cake and the brandy and the farewells at the door. She did not cry that night. She had learned early in the marriage that crying in the Ashby house felt like crying in a room where no one would ever find her. Not because Clement was cruel. He was not. He was simply indifferent in the complete untroubled way of a man who had never once considered that the woman he lived with might contain an interior life worth investigating. Cruelty required attention. Clement gave her none. She sat at her vanity and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. She was 26 years old. She had come to this house at 23 with 2 trunks, her mother's locket, and the ability to manage almost any situation she was placed in, a skill her mother had called competence, and her father had called useful, and Clement had, it turned out, called the whole of her value. She opened the drawer and took out the locket. She held it without opening it. Then she went to the wardrobe and took out the small leather traveling case she had not used since the trip to Philadelphia 2 years before. She opened it on the bed. She was methodical. A dark wool traveling dress, undergarments, her mother's Bible, the one with the spine held together by a strip of cloth she had replaced herself 3 times. A small envelope with $42.60, money set aside over the course of 2 years from the household accounts she managed. A coin here and there, never enough to be noticed. The locket, a bar of soap, her pen, and the small journal she kept in the back of the wardrobe, where Clement had never once looked. She did not take the cameo brooch he had given her on their first anniversary. She did not take the silk gloves from the Philadelphia trip. She took only what had been hers before him. By 2 in the morning the house was quiet. Clement was in his study, and then she heard him on the stairs, and then the guest room door at the end of the hall, the one he had been sleeping in for 4 months. She had not asked why. She had understood that asking would produce a particular kind of answer, measured and quiet, and designed to remind her that the question itself was an imposition. She waited until the house had been silent for half an hour. Then she dressed, put the locket in her coat pocket, picked up her case, and walked out through the kitchen, which connected to the back garden, which had a gate onto the alley behind the houses on Prospect Street. The November air was cold and sharp, and smelled of the harbor 2 blocks east. Verity had walked this neighborhood for 3 years and knew it the way you know a place you have never quite belonged to, competently, accurately, without warmth. She walked north toward the station. She had not bought a ticket in advance. She had been afraid that buying it in advance would make it feel like a plan, and a plan could be talked out of. She bought it at the window with cash, from a man who barely looked at her, for a train leaving at 5:45 in the morning for Pittsburgh, which connected to Indianapolis, which connected west. She did not know anyone in Pittsburgh or Indianapolis or anywhere west. That had felt like a problem until she was standing at the window buying the ticket, and then it had felt, briefly, entirely correctly, like a door. She had been on the platform for 20 minutes when the woman sat down beside her. She was perhaps 50, perhaps older, with the broad, capable hands of someone who had worked outdoors for most of her life, and the direct, unhurried gaze of someone who had long since stopped wasting time on unnecessary courtesy. She had a bag that was clearly well-traveled, and a coat that was practical and warm and had not been purchased to impress anyone. She did not speak immediately. She sat, the way certain people sit, as though the bench were hers, and she had graciously allowed Verity to share it. After several minutes she said, "You're going a long way." Verity looked at her. "I haven't decided how far, that's the honest answer." The woman settled her bag on her lap. Most people on a platform this early either know exactly where they're going or have no idea at all. You look like the second kind, but you don't look like you're running from something. You look like you're moving towards something you haven't named yet. Verity considered this. Is there a difference? Considerable one. The woman extended her hand. Marguerite Webb. Out of Columbus. Heading back now, Verity. She did not give her married name. Heading west. Marguerite looked at her without judgment, the way that certain women of a certain age learn to look at younger women who arrive at train platforms before dawn with one bag and a very particular expression. "I run a boarding house in Columbus," she said. "Women only, not a charity. Everyone pays, everyone works. Everyone is expected to act like a person with a future, because that's what they are." She paused. "I'm saying this because you look like someone who might need to hear that such places exist, not because I'm asking you anything." Verity looked at her steadily. "I have $42. That'll get you started." Marguerite said it as simply as she might say the weather. "The train stops in Columbus at 10:30. I can show you where I live. You can decide what you want to do with the information." The train arrived. They boarded. They sat together through the gray dawn and the Pennsylvania hills and the long Ohio flatlands, where the sky opened up in a way it never did in Baltimore. And Marguerite talked about Columbus the way people talk about places they have built rather than inherited, with knowledge and without sentimentality. She talked about the women in her house, what they had come from and what they had made of the coming. She did not talk about Verity. Verity had expected questions. She had prepared herself for them, the way she had prepared herself for most things in the last 3 years. She had been wrong about the preparation. When they pulled into the Columbus station, Marguerite stood and took her bag and said simply, "Well then." And Verity picked up her case and followed her out into the cold Ohio morning. Marguerite Webb's boarding house was on a street called Elm Court, 3 blocks from the market, in a building that was larger than it looked from the outside, and ran with the particular quiet efficiency of a place where nothing was wasted and everything had a purpose. The women who lived there moved through it with the ease of people who had been given permission to take up space, which, Verity would come to understand, was not as common as it should have been. There were 7 women in residence: a schoolteacher, 2 seamstresses, a woman who did bookkeeping for 3 businesses and asked no one's permission for anything, a young widow with a daughter who was 4 and extraordinarily serious about blocks, a woman named Prudence Oakes who had left a situation in Cincinnati that Marguerite described only as requiring immediate distance, and who had been at Elm Court for 3 months and was now helping Marguerite with the accounts. Marguerite showed Verity the small room at the back, the one with the window that faced the garden, which was brown and skeletal in November, but had the architecture of something that would matter in spring. "It's yours if you want it," Marguerite said. "First week's paid by the roof over your head. After that, $4 a month. There's work here if you need it, or you find your own. Either way." Verity stood in the room and looked at the narrow bed, the chest of drawers, the window. She thought about the house on Prospect Street, the 12 rooms she had managed for 3 years, the dinner parties, the correspondence, the careful maintenance of a life that had been dressed up as hers. She thought about Clement's voice, easy and unbothered, describing her to men who would never see her as anything but an extension of his arrangements. "I'll take it," she said. She slept for 12 hours. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of women moving through a house with the businesslike energy of people who had somewhere to be. She lay still for a moment and listened. Ordinary sounds. She had not heard anything this ordinary in 3 years. In her second week at Elm Court, Marguerite sat down across from her at the kitchen table and put a ledger between them. "You managed a household," Marguerite said. "Accounts and all." "Yes." "What exactly did you manage?" Verity told her. The full accounting of it. The suppliers, and the staff, and the social calendar, and the correspondence and the budget she had been given, and the way she had always found room within it that Clement had never thought to look for. The way she had tracked expenditure and anticipated needs before they became problems, and managed the relationship with the bank quietly enough that Clement had never been bothered with the details. Marguerite listened without expression. When Verity finished, she said, "Did he know you were doing any of that?" "He knew the results." Verity paused. "He did not know the work." Marguerite's expression shifted, just slightly. "I have 3 boarding houses," she said. "This one in Dayton, one in Springfield. I keep the books myself because I haven't trusted anyone else to do it. I'm 61 years old and I'm tired of doing it myself." Verity looked at her. "Are you offering me work?" "I'm asking what you're worth," Marguerite said. "Not what you've been told you're worth. What you can actually do." The question sat differently than any question Verity had been asked in a very long time. "I can run your books," she said. "All 3 houses. I can set up a system that shows you where the money is going, and where it's being lost, and what you could do differently. I can track it on a weekly basis so you're never surprised at the end of a quarter." She paused. "I did this for a man who never once asked how it was done. I'd rather do it for someone who wants to know." Marguerite nodded. $2 a week to start," she said, "plus your room 3, Verity said. "After the first month, when you've seen what I can do." A pause. Something that might have been a smile moved through Marguerite's expression. "Fair," she said, and pushed the ledger across the table. 3 weeks after Verity arrived in Columbus, a letter arrived from Baltimore. She knew from the handwriting on the envelope before she opened it. Clement's hand was careful and upright, the hand of a man who had been taught that penmanship reflected character. She took the letter to the garden even though it was December and sat on the cold bench under the bare elm and opened it. It was brief, 4 sentences. He had noticed her absence. He expected her to return by the end of the month. He had spoken with Reverend Michaels about the matter. He wished her to know that her continued absence would reflect poorly on both of them. She read it twice, then she folded it and sat with it for a moment in the cold. She thought about Reverend Michaels, who had a wide reach in Baltimore society, and the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told his opinion was not required. She thought about Clement's phrase, "reflect poorly," and the way it made her absence into an act of carelessness rather than a decision. The grammar of it. The way it placed her outside the sentence rather than at the center of it. She went inside and found Marguerite in the kitchen. "My husband has written," she said. Marguerite looked at her. "What did he say? That I've been careless, that I should come back." Verity set the letter on the table. "He mentioned a reverend." Marguerite refilled her own coffee and did not reach for the letter. "Does he know where you are?" "No. He knows I left. He doesn't know where I went. Did you want to respond to him?" Verity thought about it. She thought about writing something. Something that said what she needed to say. Something clear and direct. The kind of letter that contained the truth, without apology. Then she thought about Clement reading it aloud to Howard Pell and Garrett. Reading it in that easy, measured voice, finding the words that would let them all agree she was being unreasonable. Her words were not for him. He had already told her what her words were worth. "No," she said. Marguerite nodded once. "Then don't." It was that simple, and the simplicity of it settled something in Verity's chest that had been unsettled for a long time. In January, a woman arrived at Elm Court from Cleveland. She was 30, broad-shouldered, with the cautious-eyed look of someone who had traveled far on very little, and was not yet sure whether she had arrived somewhere safe. Her name was Petra Lund, and she had spent 8 years keeping the books for her husband's hardware business without title, credit, or pay, and she had left when the business was sold and she had received nothing from the transaction. Not a portion, not acknowledgement. Nothing. Marguerite sent her to Verity. They sat at the kitchen table, and Verity asked her what she could do. Not what she'd been allowed, what she could actually do. Petra blinked. Then she told her. And what she could do was considerable. Verity was teaching Petra the specific structure of Marguerite's account system 3 days later when the second letter arrived from Clement. This one was longer, and the tone had changed. He had made inquiries. He had spoken with her father, who had not known where she was either, and whose letter Verity found tucked behind Clement's, a short, bewildered note that asked her to come home and be sensible. She read both letters standing at the window of the small back room, the garden below the winter-bare elm. She read them carefully, the way she read accounts, looking for the structure behind the words, what was being stated and what was being concealed. Clement had written the word legal twice, once in the context of her obligations and once in the context of what he was prepared to pursue. He had not specified. He did not need to specify. The word did its work without elaboration. Verity set the letters on the windowsill and looked at the garden for a long time. She had known, somewhere below the surface of her planning, that this moment would come, that leaving would produce pressure, that the pressure would take this particular form because Clement did not chase things himself. He applied force through systems, through reverends and fathers and the word legal placed carefully in a sentence. She had $42 when she arrived. She had $61 now, 5 weeks of work and careful management of what she'd brought. It was not enough. It was also not nothing. She went to find Marguerite. Marguerite read both letters without hurry. When she finished, she set them on the table and looked at them with the expression of a woman who had seen this particular piece of correspondence in different handwriting many times before. "He'll push harder before he lets it go," Marguerite said. "Men like him don't pursue with passion. They pursue with persistence. It costs them less." "I know," Verity said. "What I don't know is what I have that I can stand on." Marguerite was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into the drawer of the kitchen desk and produced a small folded paper, worn along the creases from being opened and refolded many times. She set it on the table. "Your mother's family," she said. "The Callahan name, out of eastern Ohio." Verity looked at her. "I don't understand." "Your mother grew up in Guernsey County," Marguerite said. "Her people were there before her. There was land." Verity stared. "My mother died when I was 14, I know." Marguerite's voice was careful and steady. "I knew her slightly, a long time ago. Before your father, when she was still Edna Callahan and had not yet become Mrs. Callahan of Baltimore." She paused. "She came through Columbus once, before the marriage, and we sat together in this kitchen, in this room. She told me things she didn't tell other people, the way women sometimes do when they're in a safe place and won't be there long." Verity's throat tightened. She pressed her lips together. What things? That her father had left her a parcel of land in trust. Not much, 40 acres, river adjacent near Caldwell. Marguerite unfolded the paper and turned it so Verity could read. "She said she'd never claimed it because your father didn't know about it, and she was afraid of what knowing would do to the arrangement." Verity looked at the paper, her grandmother's name in faded ink. A property description in old-fashioned legal language. A recording date, 1871. My mother had land, she said. Her family did, Marguerite said. What became of your specific claim when you married Clement is a legal question. But the land was recorded in trust, specifically to pass to Edna Callahan's direct female heir. The condition makes it unusual. It was your mother's lawyer who drew it up, a man named Finch in Caldwell who is now dead, but whose records exist in the county office because his nephew took over the practice. Verity pressed her hand flat on the paper. 40 acres. River access. Her grandmother's handwriting. Why are you telling me this now? Because you're here. Marguerite said it simply. Because you came. Because your mother told me once that she hoped her daughter would be braver than she was, and I filed that away and waited. Verity looked at this woman, this solid practical woman in her solid practical kitchen, who had been carrying this for years, who had sat at this table with her mother before she was her mother, who had, without making any ceremony of it, been keeping a door open. She didn't have any words for that, she just sat with it. Then she said, I need to go to Caldwell. A man named Royce Finch practiced law above the hardware store in Caldwell, Ohio, in an office that smelled of wood shavings from below and old paper from above, a combination that Verity found, unexpectedly, entirely trustworthy. He was perhaps 40, slightly harried, with the look of a man who did careful work in a small town, and had not yet been given occasion to do anything larger. He read Marguerite's letter of introduction. He read it twice, which she was beginning to understand was how careful people read things. Edna Callahan, he said. Your mother, yes, she died in 81. I was 14. He nodded, and opened a cabinet that was organized with the precision of a man who had inherited someone else's system and improved it. He found the file in 4 minutes. He set it on the desk and turned it so she could read. My uncle drew this up in 1871, he said. Edna Callahan was 20 and not yet married. She had just inherited the land from her father, who had no sons and chose not to follow the custom of leaving property to male relatives. He had 3 daughters. He left each of them land. What happened to my aunt's shares? Royce Finch looked at her. Both married. Both husbands absorbed the property within a year of the marriages. The standard result. A pause. Your grandfather was, apparently, a man who noticed patterns. He asked my uncle to draw up a specific clause for your mother's parcel, a conditional inheritance that could not be absorbed by a husband, could not be sold by any male proxy, and could only be claimed by Edna or a direct female descendant in her own name. Verity sat very still. He anticipated it, she said. He did. Royce Finch said it without flourish. He had watched it happen twice. He decided to build a door the law couldn't close. Verity looked at the document. The clause was dense with legal language, but the meaning was clear. The land was hers. It had always been hers. It had been sitting in a county record waiting for a woman to come through the door. Can I claim it? Finch laced his fingers together. Married, no formal legal separation, he said. That complicates it. He paused. But the conditional clause is specific. The land was never part of any marital estate. It predates your marriage by 13 years and was explicitly designed to be outside spousal transfer. A judge in this county would look at this document and see a clear statement of your grandfather's legal intention. Another pause. I'm not saying it would be simple. But it isn't nothing, Verity said. Something moved through Finch's expression. No, he said. It is definitely not nothing. He began the paperwork that afternoon. Verity sat in the chair across from him and answered questions, and for the first time in 3 years answered them completely, without measuring what she said against what someone else would want to hear. She and Marguerite had made the journey together, a long day's travel east by rail. Marguerite sat outside Finch's office reading a newspaper with perfect patience while Verity was inside. And when Verity came out 2 hours later, Marguerite looked at her face and said, Well, he's filing, Verity said. Good. Marguerite stood and folded the newspaper and tucked it under her arm. Then we should eat something. They were halfway back to the station when they heard a voice. Mrs. Ashby. Verity turned. It was Howard Pell, Clement's business partner. He was standing outside the telegraph office with the look of a man who had arrived exactly where he'd intended to be and was not surprised to see her. He was not a cruel man either, she thought. He was simply a man who understood that his interests and Clement's interests were aligned and acted accordingly. Mr. Pell, she said. He glanced at Marguerite, then back at Verity. Clement has been looking for you. I happened to be in Caldwell on business. The happened was not convincing. He'd very much like you to come back to Baltimore. Verity looked at him steadily. I'm aware of what Clement would like, she said. Please tell him that if he has anything further to communicate to me, he is welcome to do so through legal counsel. She paused. Mr. Finch's office, in this town, can receive correspondence on my behalf. Pell blinked. She had never spoken to him this directly in 3 years of dinner parties. She could see it registered somewhere on him, the slight recalibration of a man encountering a surface he'd thought was smooth that has turned out to have edges. He mentioned the Reverend, Pell said. He mentioned certain obligations. Yes, Verity said. He mentioned them to me as well. She picked up her case. Good day, Mr. Pell. She walked past him toward the station. Beside her, Marguerite said nothing until they were out of earshot, and then said, Your hands are steady. My chest is not, Verity said. That's fine, Marguerite said. Different job. The letter Clement sent to Finch's office was 4 pages and arrived within the week. Verity read it at the kitchen table at Elm Court, with Marguerite across from her and Petra nearby, pretending to work on the Dayton accounts while actually listening with considerable attention. It was in some ways the most honest thing Clement had ever written to her. He wrote about reputation and the difficulty of explaining her absence to the people who mattered to him. He wrote about her obligations and his. He wrote about the Reverend Michaels, who had apparently said a number of things that Clement found supportive. And then, buried in the 3rd page, in the careful upright handwriting, he wrote something that surprised her. I have been made to understand, he wrote, by my brother Garrett of all people, that there are things you managed in this house which I had attributed to its running itself. I do not know that I have the words to address this properly. I am not certain I have ever had the right words for most things where you are concerned. She read that paragraph 3 times. It was not an apology. It was not quite a reckoning. It was something more uncomfortable than either. A man who had lived his entire life certain of his own clarity beginning, in the most halting, insufficient way, to suspect he might have been wrong about something significant. She put the letter down. She thought about writing back. She thought about what she would say if she did. Everything she had understood and performed and managed in silence for 3 years. How she had maintained the appearance of his competence while doing the actual work of it. How she had smiled at those dinner parties while something inside her went very quiet. She did not write back. Her words were not for him. He already knew what her words were worth. This was about what she could build. Instead, she wrote to Finch, who had an update. The county court had received the claim. Clement had not yet filed a counterclaim. The window for immediate contestation was still open. But Finch wrote that Clement's legal contacts in Baltimore had little reach into Guernsey County, Ohio, where the property was recorded, and where the judges had no particular reason to extend professional courtesy to a Baltimore shipping man. Verity read the letter and set it beside the page from the old record book that Marguerite had given her and that she had kept on her desk since Caldwell. 40 acres, river access, her grandfather's intention, perfectly preserved. She went back to work. By February, Petra Lund was running the Dayton accounts without assistance and had begun to ask Verity careful, precise questions about property law, the kind that told Verity she was not asking out of abstract interest. By March, a woman named Ida Swan had arrived from Zanesville with 3 children and a situation that Marguerite described only as requiring practical solutions, and who turned out to have a mind for organization that became evident within the first week. Verity taught her the same way Marguerite had taught her. Not what she was allowed to know, but what she needed to know, offered plainly, without ceremony, as though it had always been hers. She thought, working through the accounts, about her grandfather, a man she had never met, who had watched the same loss happen twice to 2 daughters and had decided that the 3rd time he was going to do something about it, who had sat down with a lawyer in 1871 and said, "Build me something the law cannot undo," who had not known that Edna Callahan would die at 44, or that her daughter would spend 3 years managed and convenient in a house in Baltimore. He had not known any of it. He had simply believed that a woman who needed the door would eventually find it. The ruling came in April. Verity was in the kitchen teaching Ida the Dayton structure when Marguerite came in with the envelope and set it on the table without a word. Every woman in the room went still. Verity picked it up. She read it standing, the way she had learned to read important things, on her feet, already ready. The Guernsey County Court of Record hereby confirms the deed of conditional inheritance recorded in 1871 as valid and binding. The claim of Verity, granddaughter of Lemuel Callahan, to the described 40 acres with river access is recognized. Title transfers effective the date of this ruling. No contesting claim has been filed. She read it twice. Then she set it down. Petra said, "Well, it's mine," Verity said. The kitchen was quiet for a full breath. Then Ida Swan, who had barely spoken in 3 weeks, pressed both hands over her mouth. Her shoulders shook. It was not crying, exactly. It was the particular sound a person makes when something they had stopped believing in turns out to be real. Marguerite went to the shelf where she kept a bottle of good bourbon and poured 4 glasses without being asked. They drank together in the kitchen on an April morning, while outside Columbus went about its business. Indifferent to the occasion, the way the world is indifferent to most of the moments that actually matter. Clement's final letter arrived 6 weeks later. It was not through his lawyer. It was handwritten, 5 pages, the longest thing he had ever written to her, and she knew that without counting because she had every letter he'd ever sent her in the 3 years of their marriage in a bundle that had taken up very little space. She sat with it for a long time before she opened it. He was leaving Baltimore. He had accepted a position with a firm in New York and would be selling the house on Prospect Street. He had spoken with his lawyer about a formal separation, which could be arranged quietly and without public proceedings, and which his lawyer had suggested was, under the circumstances, the most practical path. He wrote that Garrett had said something to him that he had not been able to stop thinking about. He did not quote Garrett. He simply wrote, "I was told that a man who fails to see the person in front of him is not, in the end, a man who can blame that person for walking away. And then, I had told myself that you were content. I understand now that I had not actually asked." She read those sentences 4 times. It was not enough. It also was not nothing, and she was learning to hold those 2 things at the same time without one canceling the other. She did not write back. There was nothing to say that the ruling from Guernsey County had not already said more cleanly. She put the letter in the bundle with the others and tied the twine and put it in the bottom of the trunk where it could stay. In May, she went to see the land for the first time. Marguerite came with her, and Ida Swan came because Ida had never been to Guernsey County and had a child who had also never been anywhere much and who turned out to find the idea of 40 acres thrilling, in the way that serious-minded 4-year-olds find large spaces thrilling. They traveled by rail and then by hired wagon, and when the wagon stopped at the edge of a long meadow sloping toward a creek, Verity stepped down and stood at the boundary of her grandfather's intention. 40 acres. The grass was high and green with spring. There was an old stone wall along the northern edge, the kind built by someone who knew they were building for a long time. The creek ran clear along the east, fast with snowmelt, cold enough to feel through the air above it. In the far corner, a stand of oak that Marguerite said would be worth something if Verity ever decided to go that direction, though Marguerite said it without recommendation. "What do you see?" Marguerite asked. "Work," Verity said. "What kind?" "The kind that makes something. The kind you can see when you're done." She walked the boundary. She made notes. She stood at the creek's edge and looked east along the water and felt the ground under her feet, particular and solid and precisely hers. Not because someone had given it to her, not because she had managed herself into it, but because her grandfather had believed it was hers before she was born and had been patient enough to wait for her to arrive and claim it. She thought about her mother, Edna Callahan, who had come through Columbus at 20, sat in Marguerite's kitchen, and left without knowing she was leaving a thread behind, who had married a man who didn't ask questions about land and raised a daughter who didn't know the door existed, who had kept a locket and a Bible and very little else that was wholly her own. Verity opened her coat and took out the locket and held it in the April sunlight. She thought, "I found it. I know I came late, but I found it." She folded the locket back into her palm and walked toward the center of the meadow, toward the place where the ground was flattest and the light was best and the stone wall made a natural boundary on the north side, and she thought about what she was going to build there. Not just a house. Something with a purpose. She had spent 3 years managing someone else's life. She knew how to manage. She knew how to organize and track and anticipate and read a ledger and know where things were being lost before anyone else thought to look. She knew how to teach these things, because she had been teaching them for 4 months in a kitchen in Columbus. She knew that there were women in every county in this state who did not know that deeds like her grandfather's deed existed, who had never held a property document, who had been kept carefully away from the knowledge that there was knowledge to have. Her grandfather had built a structure in 1871. Marguerite had kept it. Verity had found it. She was going to make sure the next woman didn't have to come as far. By August, the stone wall had a new frame inside it. By September there were walls and a roof and a proper kitchen, and a room with a long table and shelves along every wall where Verity kept documents, records, templates, the things she was learning, from Finch and from Marguerite, and from the women who had started coming. First 2, then 5, then a dozen, from 3 counties and then 4. She did not call it a charity. She did not call it a refuge. She called it what it was, a working house, a place where women came to learn what they had the right to know, where Verity showed them how to read their own documents and understand their own situations and hold their own property and ask their own questions. Some of them had situations like hers. Some of them had nowhere to go at all, and she helped them find somewhere. Some of them just needed someone to speak to them as though they were full people, and she gave them that too. Because she remembered what it had done for her. That first morning in Marguerite's kitchen, when she had been asked not what she'd been allowed to do, but what she could actually do. Marguerite came in October and walked every room and stood at the window that faced the creek and said, "What are you going to call it?" Verity had been thinking about that. She turned the question over. "Callahan's Crossing," she said. Marguerite was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandfather would have objected to the name." "I know," Verity said. "He'd have said names are for after, not during." He'd have been right. Yes. Verity looked at the room, at the shelves, at the long table, where 3 women were currently working through property assessment documents that Finch had sent over as templates. "But he's been patient long enough." Marguerite made a sound that was adjacent to a laugh. She put her hand briefly on Verity's shoulder. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. On the 1st of December, Verity sat at the writing table in Callahan's Crossing and opened a new ledger, clean-paged, with good binding, the kind built to last. She picked up her pen. She wrote at the top, December 1, 1888. Below it she wrote, "Lemuel Callahan built a door in 1871 and believed someone would walk through it." She wrote, "Edna Callahan never knew the door was there." She wrote, "Verity arrived at the door in November of 1887 with $42, 1 coat, 1 locket, and the single most important thing she had taken from her marriage. The absolute certainty, heard in a hallway at a dinner party, that she was more than what a man had decided to make of her." She set down the pen and looked out the window at the December land, the creek dark and fast, the meadow frost white, the oak stand in the corner where the light came through at an angle in the mornings that made the whole eastern edge of the property look lit from inside. 40 acres. Hers. In the county record, in her grandfather's legal language, in her own name, with her grandmother's name above it, and a date that said 1871 and a condition that said this was always meant for you, even before you were born, even before we knew your name. She picked up the pen again. Some women do not leave with noise. They leave before the city wakes, with one bag and the quiet certainty of a woman who has finally heard the truth, and they walk toward something they cannot yet name but recognize on sight. They leave and they find the door that was built for them, and they open it, and then they make it wider, so the next woman doesn't have to find it alone. She closed the ledger. Outside, the creek ran east through the frost-hard meadow. The same water her grandfather had walked beside when he decided what to build, carrying its cold cargo toward the river, which carried it further, which carried it on, in the way that water carries things, without acknowledgement, without ceremony, simply because that is what water does, and that is more than enough.